Hi, Marty Braden here, and let me welcome you to my channel. It's my hope that your curiosity which drove you to click on this video will pay off with a good deal of interesting information and possibly even a little entertainment as you watch my video. Today's video is titled One Eternal Round. Before I jump right into it, allow me to briefly explain why I started my channel. I think you'll appreciate this video as well as all my other videos that I'm doing and have done when you find out that the reason why I'm doing these videos. After 2.5 years of work, I finally finished writing a book that I decided to title An Atheist Delusion. It's my rebuttal to evolutionary biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. My book was written from a Latter-day Saints perspective on why God exists, and Richard's book was written to convince his readers with his arguments for why God doesn't exist. I'm doing this series of videos to review every single argument Richard Dawkins puts forth in his book, The God Delusion. This video you're watching now is part 84 of the series of videos I'm doing. And so I'm going to pick it up from where I left off last time. I was just ready to review the next subtitle of chapter 4 of my book, titled The Anthropic Principle, Planetary Version. So let's go ahead and jump right to that. The Anthropic Principle, Planetary Version. Richard begins this subtitle by saying the next big God of the gap submitted by theists is that of the origin of life. Subsequent evolutionary steps are duplicated in more or less similar ways throughout millions and millions of species. But Richard, I say, there are no new kinds whatsoever. Independently, he continues, continually and repeatedly throughout geological time. Therefore, he continues, to explain the evolution of complex life, we cannot resort to the same kind of statistical reasoning as we were able to apply to the origin of life. The events that constitute run-of-the-mill evolution, as distinct from its singular origins, and perhaps a few special cases, cannot have been very improvable. This distinction may seem puzzling, so I must explain it further, he says, using the so-called anthropic principle. Now, for those of you who may not know what the anthropic principle is, it's defined as the principle that says there is a restrictive lower bound on how statistically probable our observations of the universe are, given that we could only exist in the particular type of universe capable of developing and sustaining sentient life. In other words, it's the Goldilocks zone, or principle. Richard continues, the anthropic argument is usually applied to the cosmos. We exist here on Earth, and therefore Earth must be the kind of planet that's capable of generating and supporting us, however unusual, even unique, that kind of planet might be. Duh! I love it. Around a typical star like our sun, he says, there is so-called Goldilocks zone. Not too hot and not too cold, just right. Richard goes on to describe what I would say is the fine-tuning of the universe and our solar system that made it possible for life to have started and continued on in support of life and us. He says, two main explanations have been offered for our planet's peculiar friendliness to life. The design theory says that God made the world, placed it in the Goldilocks zone, and deliberately set up all the details, fine-tuned this zone, in other words. I call this setting it up with the laws of the universe. That's me speaking. So this fine-tuning is God setting into place and with his word setting up the laws that everything lives and holds up in their own bounds for our benefit. The anthropic approach is very different, Richard says, and it has a faintly Darwinian feel. He continues, the anthropic principle, like natural selection, is an alternative to the design hypothesis. It provides a rational, which implies that God design hypothesis is irrational. Isn't it odd? I don't know. That's just how I read things sometimes. He continues, design-free explanation of the fact that we find ourselves in a situation propitious, extremely favorable to our existence. Liquid water is a necessary condition for life as we know it. Water and the origin of life may have been a highly improbable occurrence. Darwinian evolution proceeds merely, quote, once life has originated. Quote, once life has originated. So all this has to be done before, and then Darwinian evolution takes over once it's been originated. But how does life get started, Richard says? Well, I like to say this. I thought natural selection is the director, the causal cause of all things. Who or what causes life itself to originate, Richard? Once life has originated is truly the $64,000 question, isn't it? I bet this question irks Richard something fierce, since scientists have never been able to produce any answer to that question whatsoever. Richard continues, quote, "The origin of life was the chemical event, or series of events, whereby the vital conditions for natural selection to first come about." Chemical event, Richard, I say? Chemical event? Life in the parental cells of animals and humans most certainly activates a new creation, a new animal, and a new human being. But where does the life or life-giving / originating power in these parental cells come from, Richard? If it's just a chemical event, then why don't biologists just go ahead and go out and dig up the minerals and make them up, or purchase the chemicals from the chemical lab depot and make the so-called event or series of events happen spontaneously? Richard goes on giving how he thinks probability happened. No facts, no evidence, no scientific method testing or proven events to point to that he can hold up as his support to his postulate. Just unreliable postulates and speaking as though it's settled science already. Richard then says, once the vital ingredient, some kind of genetic molecule, is in place, Richard has absolutely no clue what those so-called vital ingredients that generates the life and the self-duplicating power in cells are, but he continues, true Darwinian natural selection can follow, and complex life emerges as the eventual consequence, end quote. Vital ingredients? Some kind of genetic molecule? Are you kidding me, Richard? Come on, man. I say this life power that's already existing in these parental cells is what starts and gives life to these parental cells. And once these parental cells come together, that event, called conception, of life's beginning, this life activation of the DNA system that directs all life-filled cells from that moment on, causes it to start directing the protein manufacturing process. That's how life kicks in. The life indwelling in all cells is not created out of nothing. Otherwise, scientists would have already created it, don't you think? The information intelligence, the information/intelligence in the DNA code is what directs life's beginnings, and not the hijacked term or concept that Richard calls natural selection. Richard does admit that the spontaneous arising by chance of the first hereditary molecules, meaning the parental molecules making up our cells, directive cells, strikes many as improbable. You think? Maybe it is very, very improbable, and I shall dwell on this, for it is central to this section of my book, end quote. Richard fully expects chemistry and biological scientists in the next few years will report back and say they have successfully midwifed a new origin of life in the laboratory. Nevertheless, it hasn't happened yet, and it is still impossible, and it still is possible to maintain, and it is still possible to maintain that the probability of it happening is, and always was, exceedingly low, although it, spontaneous arising, did happen once, end quote. No, it was not spontaneous, Richard. It was not a spontaneous arising as you're defining it. Richard says once because we are all here, aren't we? Yes, we're here. And so obviously something like that happened. Once again, the big question is who or what was the causal cause of that so-called first spontaneous arising? I came across an online string on Quora, Quora, Q&A. It was a string of comments by several people, one of whom was a man by the name of John Cousins. John just is an ordinary guy like myself from what I could find out about him. You, of course, will be the judge, but I found John's comments to be fair and balanced. He didn't list any scientific credentials, but I found him to be credible and authentic in his statements on this subject. John said, and I quote, "Over the years, I have investigated the arguments for God by studying the Bible in depth from the beginning to the end, and I read about 25% of the Quran in the same fashion. Eventually, my interest moved on to the notion of the anthropic principle and its offshoot, the fine-tuning principle, through reading books by physicists from the likes of Paul Davis, with his controversial titles of The Mind of God or The Fifth Miracle. Martin Rees, astronomer and royale is what he's called, astronomer royale, with his book, Just Six Numbers, that indicates that there are just 6 numbers that are finely tuned for the universe we see, and more recently, a dip into Sean Carroll's deterministic universe with quote, the big picture, where it touches on fine-tuning. Having read these and many others, it seems to me we have had for years two propagandists to the universe's unfolding drama, with each defending their patch of territory with vigor. On the one hand are the religiously minded who want to believe in a loving, benevolent God who built the universe for the pleasure of free moral agents, meaning us. On the other hand, at the opposite extreme are the determinist atheists who wish to see the universe as an enormous snooker table full of atoms like snooker balls, all predictably behaving according to predetermined rules. Laplacian demon is what he called it. Thus, like any other rule-based machine, they feel it has no free agency, nor does any component of such a universe. Homo sapiens don't have any free agency. Therefore, no special relationship exists between a single component and the whole. The component is just an emerging quality of the whole. I ask, who or what set those so-called machine-based rules in the first place, John? Thus, the anthropic principle, he continues, and fine-tuning principle cannot be extracted from the polarizing debates from which the ideas have come, which brings with it understandable biases. That is not to say there aren't interesting facts about our universe worth knowing. There indeed are, but one must be aware of the continuous battle going on in the background and try to separate the data from the passion. The data anthropic principle, he starts. Let's start with looking at the data first, he says, before returning to the two principles. And these are bullet points. The sun is just the right category of star, not too old and not too young, but just right, fortuitously as its most stable period in order to supply consistent, steady light and heat. Number two, the proto-Earth was in just the exact position 4.5 billion years ago, he says, relative to the other planets, to weather the stormy beginnings and become a substrate upon which life could form. Next one, the Earth is exactly at the right distance from the sun's energy output to enable just the exact amount of heat and light necessary for molecular life to evolve. The Earth happens to have an almost circular orbit, stopping the extremes of cold and heat that would have hampered the emergence of life had it had an excessively elliptical orbit. Our planet happens to have volcanism and thus a molten interior of iron and other heavy elements that creates the Earth's unique magnetic field, without which life could never have started due to cosmic ray bombardment from the sun killing it off. He says, fortunately, that gets deflected by the Earth's magnetism. Human life with eyes that allow a very small percentage of the visible electromagnetic spectrum through, yet coincidentally the vast majority of what we have learned and understood about the universe has come from that very limited window of that spectrum of light through our eyes. Using those eyes, humans have been able to fortuitously observe a unique moon whose orbit is just right compared to the sun's distance from us to produce a perfect eclipse, without which certain deductions about light from the corona could not have been made. If the moon had been bigger, the corona would have been seen and thus analyzed. If smaller, the peripheral light would have swamped the optics, making measurements impossible. Last one, with humankind's intellect, we have now even found through mathematics. Interesting, mathematics. Where does mathematics come from? That belief that it could be figured out mathematically, and mathematics comes and the universe is being figured out. He says, through mathematics, at least 6 mathematical constants, there are others, that define natural processes. Changing their value by some insignificant amount would, it seems, be enough to render the universe devoid of life. So, for life to exist, these 6 numbers are like positions on 6 dials. The dial turning that Dawkins talks about, with any one dial even slightly off position stopping the emergence of life. Then he goes on, fine-tuned universe. Atheists unhappy with the hijacking of their own scientific findings of the various intellectual fields from biology to astronomy by the religionists understandably cause them to start fighting back. But how can one counter such strong circumstantial evidence that there is at least a designer that proposed mankind's arrival? Purpose mankind's arrival, even if you don't want to accept the notion of a loving, benevolent God. One physicist who could not help but see the contrived nature of the universe, Freeman Dyson, a physicist, in his book Disturbing the Universe, said this: "The more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known that we were coming." End quote. Atheists, and he continues, atheists counter such arguments the way religionists do. Religious people who don't wish to face the idea there is no God avoid talking about it because it's too uncomfortable. In the case of atheists, they too avoid talking about the anthropic principle, not wishing to engage it for the same uncomfortable reason. Another defense atheists use is what I call the rabbit out of the hat theory. This is still John quoting. The rabbit is an equally astonishing, untestable theory called the many worlds theory, or by its other name, the multiverse or multiple universe theory. Unhappy that religionists were gaining the upper hand, they concluded that if they could show that there were as many universes out there as there were stars in the universe, and perhaps a bit more, then that would show that our world was not so unique after all. Such a theory postulates that each universe could well have a random selection of mathematical constants of nature, with most not able to sustain life as we know it, and perhaps all except our universe not congenial for intelligent life. The theory says that the one universe just right for intelligent existence of conscious life, would likely conclude their world looks contrived and designed without the wider knowledge that they are just one of many universes. For someone like me, like John, he's still speaking, who tries to be objective, this theory is no more testable than a belief in a benevolent God, and has to be equally based on faith. Virtual world theory. Another theory that sits far better but equally untestable, this is still John, though still in the realms of hypothesis at this time, is the virtual world theory. This theory, while lurking in the background for several years, is gaining ground. It has been held down by both religiously inclined and atheists who will, with equal measure, dislike the uncomfortable ramifications of this theory to their respective worldviews, hence their keenness to starve it of oxygen. The virtual world theory, like the others, explains the contrivance we see in nature, and explains it through its champion, Nick Bostrom, a Swedish philosopher working at Oxford University. See simulation hypothesis. That's a Wikipedia thing. Go out and look for simulation hypothesis. He mentions that our advancing technology one day will, he suggested within 40 years, produce computers powerful enough, AIs or whatever, powerful enough to program it into every neuron connection within a human brain. The result, we will be able to interact with a computerized virtual person to see how it responds to us. Does it display emotion? Can we attribute consciousness to it, etc., etc.? In fact, we will be able to use it as a research tool, manipulating various connections to see what it does and whether it enhances or deteriorates a virtual person's functionality, all to learn how the brain really works. Continuing, eventually, maybe within 100 years, the computers would allow the programming thousands of human brains into it. That way, whole societies of humans can be analyzed and researched sociologically, interacting with one another, again to find the optimum way of controlling human society. This is not science fiction, he says. This is going to happen, such is the progress of technology as we see it today. The question, though, that Bostrom and a growing number of others is the following. How do we know that our world is not some kind of virtual computerized one itself, rather than being the real one we think it is? Others have extended this theory, stating that once such technology was available, we would want eventually to connect humans somehow to such computers. This in order to create a mental world manipulated by the computer with an individual's existing memories temporarily switched off, kind of held in bay for a moment. Interesting. They say this would allow youth at 14 years old, say, to live a fast-track computerized 70-year life, perhaps over a weekend, making life's mistakes in a virtual world rather than with real people. The effect after coming out of the experience with the original memories switched back on, putting back on, would be to produce a wise head on a young shoulders. Is this not what our present life achieves for us, our own 80 to 90 plus years? Are we not changed and wiser on average after 70 years than we were as a teenager? Such a machine could also be used as an employment recruitment tool as part of the employment interview. One could be placed over a weekend into the computer via some pod where the person lies with their memories temporarily removed to live out their virtual life, profiled to test the potential candidate for characteristics needed for that specific job. John Cousins concludes. Here's his conclusion. From all the theories, how does one know if any are correct? Occam's razor says, out of all the competing theories that vie for supremacy in any field, choose the one with least assumptions because it is more testable, and test it if you can. Which theories from the foregoing seems to have the least assumptions? The only one that's potentially testable is Bostrom's, this virtual world, at least to a degree that either rules it out or makes it more plausible. I'm for objectivity, he says. Let's keep a clear playing field for all the competing theories rather than the truth being restricted to just two with the loudest voices. End of comments by John Cousins. Richard continues, just as we did with the Goldilocks orbits, we can make the point that however improbable the origin of life might be, we know it happened on Earth because we are here. Well, I would ask you, my readers and my viewers, to ask yourselves this question. Which is more improbable, the coming into existence of possible trillions of universes, all expanding from their own, exploding from their own singularity, the size of a pea, or even smaller, as Stephen Hawking described it, just so the math is there for one of those trillions of universes to pop out on Earth like ours, and life as we know it can spontaneously originate, or the probability of an incomprehensible, intelligent mind that has the capability to produce the magnificence of information that can come forth with, do the coding, in other words, with the DNA code as well as the originating power to achieve the life essence bearing parent molecules that can begin new life. In other words, which causal cause or source is more probable to have the power to give and start life? Richard says, quote, there are two hypotheses to explain what happened, the design hypothesis and the scientific or anthropic hypothesis. My understanding of the word science is that it's a systematically organized body of knowledge, and therefore it makes me ask, aren't both hypotheses scientifically knowledge-based in their very nature? Richard goes on to say, the design approach postulates a God who wrought a deliberate miracle, struck the prebiotic soup with divine fire and launched DNA or something equivalent on its momentous career. There's Richard doing his humorous wordsmithing once again. I love it. In response to what Richard just said, I would simply ask you to watch a YouTube video titled Scientists Speak Out About Evidence of the Intelligent Design in Nature. Scientists speak out about evidence of intelligent design in nature. It's an incredible video because it has world-renowned scientists speaking in support of intelligent design. One such scientist is Charles H. Towns, a Nobel laureate in physics. Charles, as a practicing Christian, has always seen religious faith and scientific investigation as convergent paths to ultimate truth. That sounds a lot like my illustration I have written in the early part of my book on pure science and pure religion, or faith converging at the beginning of the millennium, where it becomes one great whole, right? Here's what Mr. Towns said. Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. The video is only 2.5 minutes long, but I'm confident you'll appreciate its contribution to the discussion we're having here. Now listen to this next statement made by Richard. It isn't, I want you to look at this and see if it's not what I call wishful thinking. Then I don't know what it is if you don't think it is. Richard continues, we live on a planet where we are surrounded by perhaps 10 million species, each one of which is independently displays a powerful illusion of apparent design, quote, intelligent design. Each species is well fitted to its particular way of life. The question for me, once again, becomes, who did the fitting, Richard? I would have you consider the number of years it would take for these 10 millions of species, each with their own multiple individual complexities, to evolve to the point where they're fully well fitted for their particular individual environments, including individualized fingerprints finding their way onto our billions of fingers, etc. Everything's perfectly fitted, perfectly finished, perfectly good, which is exactly what God said when he finished his creative work. He declared after each creative period, it is good. But keep in mind, this world was in its paradisical state, the perfect state that existed before the fall when he made that statement. If Richard's theory is correct, the time that would be required to do all of this fitting would be well beyond the 4.7 plus years of lifespan of our Earth's existence, wouldn't it? You do the math. Consider the math on that. Richard continues, could we get away with the huge numbers of planets argument to explain all these separate illusions of design? No, we could not, he says. I repeat, we could not. Don't even think about it. This is important, for it goes to the heart of the most serious misunderstanding of Darwinism. We really need Darwin's powerful crane to account for the diversity of life on Earth. And this is me. If we're going to eliminate God as the causal cause for it all, that's what he's saying. We need to come up with the crane. And especially the persuasive illusion of design. The origin of life, by contrast, lies outside the reach of that crane, because natural selection cannot proceed without it. Did you read that? Did you hear that? Now prepare for it. See what Richard says next. He says this, we can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating, which is another word for guessing, a very large number of planetary opportunities. He continues, once that initial stroke of luck, there's the point I want you to listen to, that initial stroke of luck or chance has been granted by who or what? And he says, and the anthropic principle most decisively grants it to us. Really, Richard? Come on, man. Again, no proof, no testing, no observation, and yet Richard emphatically states this as though it is settled science that says it is the simplest possibility. Natural selection takes over, and it emphatically is not a matter of luck, Richard. Talk about speaking in circles. Luck, chance. How about incredible, perfect, information-based creation from an incredibly brilliant, perfectly intelligent, and glorious mind? The mind of God. Richard then says natural selection works because it is a cumulative one-way street to improvement. It needs some luck, a word atheist seems to use to substitute for in place of God, to get started, and the billions of planets anthropic principle grants it that luck. A principle, an idea granting luck? Richard, come on. Now who's talking the impossible or improbable? The idea of trillions of universes coming into existence because of trillions more universes that came before them, back infinitum, granting this luck? Really? Come on, man. Doesn't this beg the question of infinite regression once again as to who created the billions or trillions of universes and their repeated big bangs ad infinitum? You can't have it both ways, Richard. Who's delusional now? If trillions of universes isn't a statement of absolute blind faith, I again don't know what blind faith is. There is absolutely no observable, tested proof to support the reality of these billions or trillions of universes existing or coming to existence through the process of trillions of singularity big bangs taking place over billions of years by sheer luck, which is how scientists say our own universe got started, right? Talk about a low percentage of probability on Richard's probability spectrum. Good grief. Let me interject a thought here, though. I ask you to take a moment and imagine in your mind that you're holding a gold wedding band, a gold ring between your thumb and your index finger. As you do, consider the inside of that ring. Can you see a beginning and an end? No. This is a micro lesson of what eternity or infinity is. It's called one eternal round. Infinity is a state or quality of being infinite, without a beginning or an end. Infinite is limitless or endless in space, extent, or size, impossible to measure or calculate, meaning you cannot find the beginning from the end of the ring. Both atheist scientists and theist scientists understand what infinity is and means, and I would even suggest that they believe in infinity or the infinite. Don't you? So if they believe in this concept of infinity, which has no beginning or end like the inside of the gold ring example I offered, why wouldn't this description be an accepted answer for the question of infinite regression? If space and time are infinite, why can't the genealogy of our Father in heaven be infinite? If the scriptures it is referring to as without a beginning of days or an end of years, this concept is just a good answer for this question of infinity or infinite regression as any other. My perspective is that our mind cannot comprehend these mysteries of godliness. There are some we just can't comprehend. He said, my ways are not your ways. Neither are my thoughts your thoughts, nor can it comprehend what without a beginning of days or end of years really is. The eternality of God, our Creator, and the eternality of His creations, including you and I, is beyond man's limited, puny minds trying to understand it. Richard appears to be saying that there would be enough by chance power in his evolutionary cosmological crane theory to bring into existence, or crane lift hit scaffolding into existence, the billions or trillions of universes needed for them to pop out another one-of-a-kind planet, Earth, like our own. The 1 in a billion chance, in other words. But then, for this to be probable, there would have to be an ancestral trillions of universes that came into existence, and long before these trillions of universes, in order for each of them to have the numbers to pop into existence, that one of a kind in a billion Earth, right? If this isn't totally improbable blind faith, then there's no such thing. Talk about a flying spaghetti monster, Richard. Come on, man. It's more like a trillion flying spaghetti monsters popping out one improbable meatball every billionth year, ad infinitum, until there's a full universe plate of celestial spaghetti and cosmological meatballs. That's what the multiverse theory sounds like to me. Once again, I say to you, this is one more reason why I called my book An Atheist Delusion. So we're going to move on now to the next subtitle, The Anthropic Principle Cosmological Version. And that's the next video I'm going to do. I want you to stop, and I want you to type in your questions. I want to hear your comments. I want to read them, and I'll do my best to get back to them as best I can. But this has been a fun one, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope it satisfied your curiosity and that you'll want to come back. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. I don't say that often, but I can see that each subscriber adds more and gets it out to a few more people. So I appreciate if you do that. But until next time, I want to wish you all continued success. Goodbye.